Very special performance by Helene Meltzer, a woman of many talents and even more stories to tell. A devoted mother, grandmother, and cherished member of our community. Helene brings warmth, wit, and wisdom to everything she does. After raising her family, she boldly entered law school at the age of 39, proving that it's never too late to begin a new chapter. Helene served as president of Hadassah for 10 years, where she honed her comedic timing and charm that you'll see in full display today. She continues to be an active and valued member of the TBK board and a proud member of Sisterhood and Men's Club. Having once lived in France with her husband Bernie, and with a lifetime of experience behind her, Helene brings a unique perspective and a great sense of humor to the stage. Please join me in welcoming Helene's family, who is here today from New York, her daughters Amy and Mindy, son-in-law Kenny, and a special welcome to her granddaughter Abigail. We are so delighted that you've come. It really is very, very special. And I understand how you love your grandmother and mother.
And Carol, Miss Makatunim from Miami.
You didn't tell me that. Not my fault. You'll tell them. Please sit back, relax, and enjoy the delightful and entertaining Helene Meltzer. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. And Todd, thank you, thank you. It's going to be a very, very tough act to follow. I don't know if I should be mad at you or not. It was terrific. So good afternoon, everybody. It's so wonderful to see all of you and so many familiar faces. It's just great. Now, we've all heard that laughter is very good for your heart and your overall health. So I am hoping after you hear me today, you'll all be so healthy, you're going to leave the cars in the parking lot and jog home. But before I start, I want to tell you that some of the stories and jokes I may be telling you today might be a bit offensive because of the language and the subject matter. But just remember that everything is said in fun, and I have no intention of insulting or offending anyone. So here we go. I want to start off by talking to you a little bit about something that those of you know nothing about, and that is getting older. You know, when I was a kid, I couldn't wait to get older. But you know what? I didn't expect this. I thought it was going to be better. In the morning, I can roll out of bed with no problem. Getting up off the floor is another story. And sometimes I look in the mirror and I say, what the hell happened? Pretty scary. Also, people my age, usually, some of them, can go hiking, they climb mountains. Me, I'm happy I don't fall over when I put on my underwear. And you know what? I can't walk past a bathroom anywhere without saying to myself, I might as well go in and pee. And sometimes I laugh so hard that the tears run down my legs. And you know what? I still have something on the ball, but I'm just too tired to bounce it. An old man, he's about 95, he goes into a brothel and he says to the madam, I would like a young woman for all night. And the madam looks at him and she says, how old are you? He says, I'm 95. She said to him, you're 95? don't you know you've had it? And he said, oh, sorry, how much do I owe you? Another old man is in the hospital, and the nurse comes in and she's gonna give him a sponge bath. So he says to her, are my testicles black? And she looks at him and she said, I don't know, I'm not here to do that, but I'll do you a favor and I'll pull back the blanket and I'll look. And she looks and she says to him, no, your testicles aren't black. He said, no, I asked you if my test results are black. A little boy asked his grandpa, you know, Grandpa, you've been married to Grandma for so many years, and it's really nice. You call her honey, sweetheart, baby. How come? Grandpa says, to tell you the truth, I forgot her name about 15 years ago, and I'm afraid to ask. Now, Mildred and Edna are going out to lunch, and Mildred is driving. So they come to an intersection, very heavily trafficked, and she goes right through the red light. Edna is sitting there, she doesn't say anything. They come to another red light, and Mildred goes right through again. Now Edna is getting very upset. The third time it happens, she goes right through the light. Edna says to her, Mildred, do you know you've gone past 3 red lights? You're going to get us killed. And Mildred turns around to her and says, oh, am I driving? A widow and a widower meet each other at a high school reunion 50, 60 years later, whatever. And they realize they used to be boyfriend and girlfriend. So they start spending the night. They sit together, they have a couple of drinks, and they're having a really good time. And finally, the man says to the woman, you know, I'd like to marry you. And she said, oh yes, I would love that. And they go off to their separate hotel rooms. The next morning, her phone rings. She picks it up and he says, hi, I'm a little embarrassed to tell you, but my memory isn't as good as it used to be. So I think I asked you to marry me, but I don't remember what you said. So she said, oh, of course I said yes. I'm so glad you called because I couldn't remember who asked me. How many of you remember Art Linkletter's show, Kids Say the Darndest Things? Well, they still do. A 5th grade teacher had a class portrait taken of her students, and she was trying to get them to buy a copy to take home, and nobody was buying. So she said, oh, you know, it would be so nice if you had this picture, and 30 years from now you could look and say, oh, look, there's Barbara, she's a doctor. Or look, there's Jack, he's a lawyer. And from the back of the room, a little voice yells, oh, look, there's the teacher, she's dead. A little 3-year-old is in the bathtub and his mommy is there with him. And he's looking at his testicles, and he says to her, Mommy, are these my brains? And the mother thinks, no, not yet. A grandfather takes his 6-year-old grandson to the mall. And of course, the grandfather loses the kid. So now the kid is wandering around, and the security guard comes up to him and says, oh, are you lost, little boy? He said, yes, I can't find my grandpa. So the guard says to him, well, what's your grandpa's name? He said, Grandpa. Then he says to him, well, what does he look like? He has gray hair. So then finally the guard says to him, well, what's he like? And the kid says, women with big boobs and 20-year-old scotch. you ever thought about people who work in the circus? No. Well, a big-time circus needed a lion tamer, so they put an ad in the paper, and 2 people applied. One was this gorgeous girl wearing a raincoat, and the other was a guy. And in the cage is this lion, and if I tell you ferocious, growling and scratching and carrying on. And the woman says, oh, I'll go first. She steps into the cage, and she takes off her coat, and she's absolutely naked. The lion starts running and growling, and when he gets to the woman, he looks at her, and he looks down, and he falls down at her feet, and he starts licking her toes and her ankles and her legs. So the manager says to the other applicant, can you do that? He says, I will if you take the lion out of the cage. A couple work for the circus, and they decide they want to adopt a child. So they go to a social worker, an adoption agency, and the woman says, you know, I'm very concerned. You people live a very transient life. You don't really have a home. I don't know how the child would be educated, and you probably eat a lot of junk food. So I don't know if we could give you a child. The man says, listen to me. We have the most gorgeous railroad car, all fitted out like a beautiful home, and there's a special room for the child filled with toys. So she looks, and he says, as far as the education, I hired an English nanny and a professor to travel with us, and the child will be homeschooled and taken care of. And as far as the food, I hired a French chef. The kid will want for nothing. He'll have the finest of foods. So now the social worker is very, very impressed, and she said, well, you know, you passed all the criteria. How old do you want the child to be? And the man says, we don't care as long as it fits in the canon. I want to talk about animals for a little bit. An 85-year-old man is walking through a forest, and he hears something going psst, psst. He takes a look, and there's this enormous, hideously ugly frog on a rock. And he gets closer, and the frog says, Mister, please kiss me. I'm really a beautiful, beautiful princess. Someone put a hex on me, and I need somebody to kiss me. And the guy is looking at her, and he's getting nauseous. I mean, really disgusting. And she says, please, please, I'll be your sex slave. I'll have sex with you day and night, however you want it, whatever you want to do. Please kiss me. And the man looks at the frog and says, you know, I'm 85. I'd rather have a talking frog. A dog is walking down the street, and he sees a help wanted sign in an office. So he goes in, and the manager comes up to the dog and says, what are you doing? And the dog points to the sign, and he goes, woof, woof. Well, the manager, he doesn't know what to do. So he says to the dog, well, you know, anyone who gets this job has to know how to work the phones. With that, the dog jumps up on the desk, he picks up the phone, he's dialing, he's pushing the buttons, and he's going, ruff, 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 ruff. The manager's very impressed, but he wants to get rid of the dog. So he says, you know, that whoever gets the job also has to work a computer. The dog goes, like, don't worry, gets on another desk, turns on a computer, and he's busy, ruff, 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 and he's working on the computer. Now, the manager is really totally at a loss, so he says to the dog, well, whoever has this job has to be bilingual. And the dog looks up at him and goes, Meow. A man brings a big St. Bernard dog into temple. And the rabbi says, I'm very sorry, but we don't allow dogs in the sanctuary. The man says, this is a special dog. And with that, the dog opens up the cask he's got around his neck, pulls out a yarmulke, pulls out a talis, and pulls out a siddur. And he starts davening in Hebrew. The rabbi says to him, oh my God, this is amazing. You should take this dog to Hollywood. You'll be a millionaire. The man says, you talk to him. He wants to be a doctor. A woman calls her rabbi, and she says, Rabbi, I have such a problem. I need you to help me. I have a parrot, a female parrot, and she's terrible. She's very fresh. Anybody comes into the house, she wags her tail, and she says, you want to have fun? The rabbi says, oh, no. This can't be. I have 2 male parrots. They sit in their cage all day, and all they do is daven. They pray. I even got them little yarmulkes and talit, and they have little prayer books. You bring your female over to me tomorrow. We'll put her in the cage, and she will see how to behave. Well, the next morning, she comes, brings the female parrot. Parrot gets into the cage, and she takes a look, and she starts wagging her behind, and she says, boys, want to have fun? And one male says to the other, Irving, put down the siddur. Our prayers have been answered. A magician gets a job on a cruise, and he's thrilled because that means he can do the same act every week because it's different people. There was only one problem. The captain had a pet parrot, and the parrot started watching the act. And after a couple of weeks, the parrot figured out how he was doing all the tricks. So when the magician would do a trick, the parrot would say, look, he's got the card under his sleeve. Or, look, that deck of cards is only the ace of spades. Or look, I saw what he did. He hid it under the table. And the magician really grew to hate this parrot. The parrot wasn't so fond of him either. One night, there's a huge storm, and the ship is totally destroyed. Luckily, the magician found a piece of driftwood, and he hung on to it. And lo and behold, the parrot is on the other end of the driftwood. The 2 of them are floating in the ocean, staring at each other with hate, and not saying one word. And finally, after 3 days, the parrot says, all right, I give up. Where'd you hide the fucking ship? We usually do not talk about the pearly gates and death in a light fashion, but sometimes you just have to. 3 men are out on a Christmas Eve, and they're getting drunk and carousing and driving, and sure enough, they have a terrible car accident, and they all die. They go up to the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, I'm not letting the 3 of you in here. You were out drinking. You have no idea what the Christmas spirit is. So one of them says, no, you're wrong, St. Peter. And he starts looking in his pockets, and he pulls out his keys, and he jingles them, and he says, look, jingle bells. So St. Peter says, okay, you can go in. The next one also looks all around. He gets out his cigarette lighter. He lights it, and he says to the St. Peter, look, Christmas lights. Okay, you go in. Now the third one is hysterical because he doesn't know what he's going to do. But he starts feeling around, and he puts his hand in his pocket, and he pulls out a pair of panties, and he holds them up to St. Peter. And St. Peter says, what has this got to do with Christmas? And the guy says, they're carols. men die on the same night. And they're up by St. Peter, and they're standing on line. So one says to the other one, so how did you die? He said, well, I froze to death. So the guy said, oh my God, that sounds terrible. He says, no, it wasn't so bad. I got very, very cold, and then I fell asleep, and I died. So he says to him, how did you die? He said, well, I had a massive heart attack. What happened? I was convinced my wife was having an affair. So I came home very, very early from work, and I ran up the stairs to the bedroom, and she was alone. Then I ran all the way up to the attic, and there was nobody there. He said, then I ran all the way down to the basement, and I had a major heart attack and died. And the first guy said, you know, this is ironic. If you had looked in the basement and opened the freezer, we'd both still be alive. A man called his rabbi and said, you know, Rabbi, I need your advice. I had this terrible desire to live forever. And I know that's not going to happen. It's very disturbing to me. What should I do? And the rabbi said, get married, you'll lose the desire. A young, very religious Catholic couple are on their way to get married. And they have a car accident. And they wind up in heaven. So they said to St. Peter, you know, we really wanted to get married. Excuse me. Do you think you could find a priest up here to marry us? So St. Peter said, well, I think so. Let me look around and I'll get back to you. 3 months later, St. Peter says to them, oh, I found you a priest. He's ready to marry you. And then the woman says, well, you know, I've been thinking, what if this doesn't work out and we need to get a divorce? And St. Peter says, for God's sakes, it took me 3 months to find a priest up here. How long do you think it's going to take me to find a lawyer? A man also calls his rabbi. We call the rabbi for everything. And he says, Rabbi, I am very disturbed. I think my wife is trying to poison me. And the rabbi says, don't be ridiculous. I'm going to call her and find out what this is all about. The next day, the rabbi calls the man and he says, listen, I called your wife. I spoke to her for 3 hours. She hocked me a chinik. She never stopped talking. I don't know what she was talking about. You really want my advice? Take the poison. Speaking of poison, a woman walks into a pharmacy and she says to the pharmacist, I would like to buy some arsenic. He said, what are you, nuts? What do you want it for? I want to kill my husband. He said, I can't give that to you, that's illegal. So with that, she takes a picture out of her pocketbook and shows it to him. And it's a picture of her husband and his wife in bed together. And the pharmacist says, oh, I didn't know you had a prescription. You know, even in today's social media world with J-Date and Yoo-Hoo and whatever else, it is hard to find the one. So this woman goes to a singles weekend. She's there all weekend and meets no one. Very dejected, she's waiting in the lobby for her Uber driver, and in walks this really good-looking guy. But she notices his clothes look a little old-fashioned, and his suitcase is a little battered, but she's so desperate she doesn't care. He walks up to the desk, and she walks up there with him. And she says to him, oh, hi, I haven't seen you this weekend. He said, well, I was away. So she said, what do you mean away? He said, well, to tell you the truth, I've been in prison for 20 years. She said, 20 years? What did you do? He said, I murdered my wife. And she looks at him and says, "Oh, so you're single?" This very religious couple were very concerned because their son was not getting married. So they hired a matchmaker. She comes to the house, and the mother is telling her, well, we want her to be beautiful, we want her to want children, she has to keep a kosher home, she has to observe Shabbos. The matchmaker says, don't worry, I'll find somebody. A couple of weeks later, she comes back, and she says, I found the woman. She's so gorgeous, you'll drop dead when you see her. She's religious, she's kosher. She wants to have as many children as possible. And the son is listening, and he says to the matchmaker, I have to ask you this. How is she in bed? And the matchmaker says, some say yes, some say no. A woman walks into a gourmet fruit store, and she says to the guy behind the counter, do you have nuts? He said, no, I don't. She said, do you have dates? He said, I told you, I have no nuts. If I had nuts, I'd have dates. You know, after marriage, things always don't go that well. Things happen. A man is a respectable businessman, married. He's having an affair with a young Italian woman. She comes to him one day and she says, I have to tell you, I'm pregnant. He panics. He says, well, what can I do? I'm respectable, I have a family, I can't marry you. He says, I know. If you move to Italy, I will pay all your expenses. I will take care of the child and you for the rest of your lives. So she said, okay, but how will you know when the baby is born? He said, just send me a postcard with the word spaghetti, and then I'll increase the payments. So 9 months later, he comes home from work, and his wife says to him, you got a really crazy postcard today. So the man looks to the postcard and drops down in a faint. The postcard said, spaghetti, 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 spaghetti. 3 with meatballs, 2 without, send more sauce. A very, very henpecked husband read a book about how to be a domineering person. So he comes home and he says to his wife, you know what, I'm not taking your junk anymore. From now on, I'm running this house. So you're gonna go in that kitchen, you're gonna make me a wonderful steak dinner, you're gonna do the dishes. After dinner, we're gonna watch television, shows that I wanna see. And then we're gonna go upstairs to bed, and we're gonna have sex. The kind of sex I like, not yours, and as many times as I want. Then afterwards, you're gonna give me a bath, you're gonna dry me off, you're gonna comb my hair. He said, and guess who's gonna be dressing me in the morning? And she looks at him and says, I would imagine the undertaker. This is one of my favorites. A woman goes to her newly married son, opens the door, and there's the daughter-in-law, ungesprayt, on the couch with no clothes. The woman says to her, what's this? She said, oh, this is my love dress. When he comes home from work and sees me, he can't get enough of me. We make mad, passionate love all night. The woman thinks it's a little crazy and she leaves. But on the way home, she thinks to herself, you know, this is not such a bad idea. So she gets in the house, she gets herself on the pits, she takes a shower, she does her hair, and she lays herself out on the couch. Her husband comes in, he takes one look, and he says to her, what's this? She said, it's my love dress. He said, it needs ironing. The CIA advertised for an assassin. 3 people answered the ad, 2 men and a woman. So they get into this room, and there's a closed door. And the agents say, behind that door is your spouse. We're gonna give you a gun, and you have to go in there and kill your spouse. So the first guy says, oh, you've gotta be nuts, I'm not doing that, and he walks out. The second guy takes the gun, and he walks up to the door, and he says, no, I can't do this, I don't want the job. Next comes the woman. She takes the gun, she goes in, slams the door, and they hear banging, screaming, yelling, carrying on for about a half hour. She finally comes out and she says, you know, you guys put blanks in the gun. I had to beat him to death with a chair. A woman was suffering from terrible, terrible headaches. And her friend said, you know, there's a medicine man in the hills who could help you. So she goes up to see him, and she comes back and she says to her husband, the guy is a miracle worker. I don't have a headache. So the guy says, well, what did he tell you? He told me to stand in front of a mirror and just say, I don't have a headache. I don't have a headache. I don't have a headache. And then she says to him, you know, you haven't been that good in the bedroom lately. Maybe you ought to go see the medicine man. So he goes, and he comes back, and he walks in the house and goes into the bathroom. He comes out, and they're having sex like they haven't had their honeymoon. He finishes, he goes back in the bathroom, he comes out, and again, another round. By the 3rd time, he goes into the bathroom, and the wife says to herself, I gotta go see what he's doing in there. And she walks in, and he's standing in front of the mirror, and he says, she's not my wife. She's not my wife. She's not my wife. An older couple were having trouble in the bedroom. What else is new? And they go to a sex therapist. And the therapist says, you know, I have a very good idea. The next time you have sex, have somebody stand there and wave a towel over you. Well, they think it's a little nutty, but they get home and the pool boy happens to be there. So they ask him if he would come up and help them. So they get into bed and they're having sex, and she's laying there like a limp rag. Nothing's happening. And the boy waving the towel. Finally, the old man says, oh, I have a better idea. You get in the bed, I'll wave the towel. So the boy says, okay, the pool boy. He gets in bed with her, and he's not in there with her for 2 seconds. And she's screaming and moaning and scratching his back and carrying on. And the old man is there waving a towel, and he says to the kid, that's how you wave a towel. A couple had a horrific marriage. They did nothing but fight, day after day after day. Finally, she said to him one day, get out. I can't take this anymore. I've had enough. He very happily runs and packs his suitcase, and he walks to the door, and she says, wait, before you go, I just want you to know, I hope you have a long, miserable, nasty life. And he looks at her and says, oh, now you want me to stay? A man goes to his priest and he says, Father, I have to confess, I'm a married man and I almost had intercourse with another woman. The priest said, what do you mean almost? He said, well, she was rubbing it, but I didn't put it in. The priest said, I don't care. Rubbing is the same thing as putting it in. You go say 5 Hail Marys and put $50 in the poor box. So the guy goes out, he says the Hail Marys, and the priest is watching him, and he walks over to the poor box, and he's got $50 in his hand, and he's rubbing and rubbing. And finally, the priest says to him, I told you to put it in the poor box. He said, well, you said rubbing is the same as putting it in. A man is riding on a bus to work one day, and a lovely woman comes on and sits down next to him, and she's got a little baby. And she starts to breastfeed the baby, and the baby's not taking it. So she says to the baby, listen, baby, you have to take this, because if you don't take this, I'm going to give it to the nice man sitting next to me. This happens like 2 or 3 times, and every time the kid doesn't want it, and she says, if you don't take this, I'm going to give it to the man right next to me. And finally he says, listen, kid, make up your mind. I was supposed to get off 4 stops ago. A very, very prestigious man runs a big major corporation, and he decides to take all of his main executives on a resort, on a retreat. So they go to this retreat, and they have a couple of meetings, and then the man goes, they all go to their rooms. He's not in there 5 minutes, and he hears a knock on the door. He opens the door, and there's this gorgeous redhead standing there with a beautiful coat on. And he says to her, who are you? She said, well, I have to tell you, your chief executive officer hired me to send me up here and let you have a really good night. The man says, what? He goes to the phone, he picks it up and calls it, and he says, are you crazy? I am a married man. How dare you? This is outrageous. You are off the board, you are fired, no pension, and I never want to see you again. And he slams the phone down. He turns around, and the woman is putting on her coat. He says to her, where are you going? She said, well, you were so mad and angry. He said, I'm not mad at you. A guy is marooned on an island for 10 years. One day he sees this little black spot on the horizon, and he figures he's going to get saved. But as he gets closer, it's not a ship, it's somebody in a wetsuit. And the person steps out of the ocean, and he realizes it's a beautiful shaped woman. And she says to him, oh, hi. How long has it been since you had a good cigar? He said, well, I've been here for 10 years. So she pulls down the zipper, takes out a cigar with a lighter, and says, here, have a smoke. He's smoking away, he can't believe his good luck. Then she says to him, how long has it been since you had a good whiskey? He said, I just said, I'm here 10 years. So she pulls down another zipper and pulls out a bottle of 20-year-old scotch with a glass and hands it to him. Now he's smoking, he's drinking. He thinks he went to heaven. And with that, she starts unzipping the middle zipper, and she says to him, how long has it been since you played around? And he said, oh God, don't tell me you have a set of golf clubs in there. A sailor goes into a bar, and he sees a pirate sitting at the bar. The guy's got a wooden leg, a hook arm, and a patch over his eye. So the sailor says to him, you know, excuse me, you must have been in a lot of battles to have all these injuries. The pirate says, well, you know, not exactly. I got the wooden leg because I fell overboard, and before my crew could rescue me, a shark bit my leg off. He says, and I got the hook because I was caught stealing in a country where they cut off your hand if you steal. And I got the patch because a seagull dropped droppings in my eye. So the sailor says to him, you have a patch in your eye because there was seagull droppings? And the pirate says, well, it was my first day with the hook. I've saved these two for the last, and I hope nobody takes offense. A family is sitting around the table, a teenage boy and girl and the parents. And the boy says to the father, "What could you tell me about a woman's boobs?" So the father says, "Well, when they're 20, 30, they're like melons. Let me tell you, really nice and firm. Then when they get to be around 40 or so, they start to look like pears. Still attractive, but not that great. But then after 60, they're like onions." The kid says, "What do you mean onions?" He says, "Well, when you look at them, they make you cry." Now the mother is mad, and she says to the girl, "Would you like me to tell you about the private parts of a man?" The girl says, "Sure." So she says, "Well, when they're 20 or 30, it's like an oak tree. You could always depend on it. It's always there. It's great. Then when they get to be 50 and more, it's kind of like a willow tree. You know, you can't really depend on it. It bends in the breeze. It's not that great. Then she says, when they're after 60, it's like a Christmas tree." And the girl said, "What kind of Christmas tree?" She said, "Well, it's dead from the roots up, and the balls are only for decoration." I have one more that I'd like to tell you. A woman's husband dies, and she goes to a funeral parlor, and she says to the funeral director, "I would like to cremate him." The director says, "Okay, what kind of urn would you like?" And she says, "No, I don't want an urn. You just give me his ashes in my hands." Funeral director thinks this is weird, but he does it. She gets the ashes and she goes outside and she says, "You know, Irving, remember when I wanted that mink coat and you wouldn't get it for me? You gave it to your mistress." And she said, "You remember that time I begged you to take me to Europe and you said we couldn't afford it, but you took the mistress?" And she said, "You remember that time I wanted a new car and you wouldn't get it for me, but you gave it to the mistress?" She said, "Now, Irving, you remember when you always wanted a blowjob?" Thank you.